Hi, this is a quick introduction to the Blender user interface for students in a one-week summer app camp. What we're looking at in front of me is what Blender looks like when you first open it. This is not a typical Windows or OS X type of user interface. Blender has its own concept of how to lay out windows in order to make dealing with 3D scenes more convenient. At the top we have a menu. On the left we have a set of tools. If I look at the right, there is an outline of the scene which tells me which objects are in it. So I can point out really quickly, if I click just right in between there, I get a little stretch bar and I can pull that down. And we can see that the currently selected thing, because it's indicated in white here, is the cube. In the middle of the screen, that cube is indicated with orange. Right? In a scene, there's also a camera, which is right here, and a light, which is right here. And then again in Blender, there are a number of different aspects of the objects in the scene that you can manipulate, and they're categorized into little tabs on the right. We're going to spend most of our time here, where we're looking at object properties, or here, where we're looking at object materials. So really quickly, in order to interact, and of course down at the top bottom there's a timeline because we're going to be doing animations. But for now, I want to show you how to do the basic interaction with Blender using your mouse. So I'm going to take my mouse, and my mouse has three buttons: your left button, your middle mouse button, which is sometimes actually the scroll wheel, which you can push down on, and a right mouse button. So in order to select items in Blender, it's going to be different than what you're used to. To select an item, you right-click on it. I'm about to select the light by right-clicking my mouse over top of the light. So now my light has been selected, and instead of materials, I have different properties of the light. I'm not going to go into those right now, and we can see it selected up in the outline. If I go to my camera, which is this little cone-looking thing, and right-click, I can select my camera. I can right-click on my cube. Some of you might be making a mistake where you left-click. Here's what happens when you left-click. So what happens is a little crosshairs goes wherever you left-click, and that's called your 3D cursor. You can position this 3D cursor anywhere in the scene, in 3D space, and when you add new objects, they'll show up there. I'll get into that later. You've got one more button on your mouse, your middle mouse button. If you press it, being careful not to scroll, and you move your mouse around, you can orbit around the center of your scene. So you can orbit around like this. Now if you have a mouse wheel, you can wheel up and down to zoom in and out of your scene. You can also press the control or command buttons. The control button, and you can zoom in and out by dragging your mouse up and down while you've got control held. Pressing the middle mouse button with control down lets you zoom in and out. Now some of you may have noticed these three arrows. You've got a green, a red, and a blue arrow. Those arrows correspond to, if you look down in the lower right, the X, Y, and Z axis of the cube. So in a scene in general, this is going to be the front of the cube. X goes to your right, Y goes straight back, and Z points up. So this would be looking at the front of the cube. This is the top, and this is the right. So the X, Y, and Z are in red, green, and blue colors. They allow you to keep your frame of reference straight. So each one of these panels, you can move them around by putting your cursor over them, and you get a crosshair. If you right-click, you can actually manipulate these things. So you can right-click and hit split area, and then I can divide this viewpoint into two viewpoints so I can see the same scene from two different points of views while I'm working on it. Over here, this is my toolbox. You'll notice that it got duplicated in each scene. If you want to hide the toolbox, put your cursor over the scene. Now I want you to look very closely at what happens when I move my mouse from one panel to another. If you can notice, the menu bar at the bottom changes color when I'm in the scene. So when I'm in the scene, it's a little bit brighter. So if I put my cursor here, I can tell I'm there because this menu bar at the bottom, which deals with this panel above it, in general those menu bars deal with the panels above them, turns brighter, and then I hit the T button and it'll hide the toolbox. So pressing it again will show it, hiding it and showing it. I also have a properties window. The N button will show or hide properties of the object. Remember, we're in 3D space, so everything has an X, Y, and a Z coordinate. Right? So I can hide them both by pressing T and N. Down here at the bottom, I can pick different views. If I hit View, I can choose to view it from the front, top, left, bottom, or right. So I can choose to look at this one from the front, and sure enough, my X goes to the right and my Z goes up. If I put my cursor here, I hit Split Area, I can define a new view from perhaps the top. So this is how, having multiple views, maybe one that you're freehand editing and another one where you can see it from different perspectives, helps you organize your scene. So these little arrows, if you click on one with your left mouse button and pull, you can actually move your object in that direction. So if I click on the blue area, I can move it straight up. Remember, Z goes up. If I click on the red, I can move it left and right. And if I want to move it backwards and forwards, I can click on this green arrow, and I can do it in either view. If I want to freely move it, I click on the white circle, and then I can freely move it within that view. Generally, I don't do this because it gets hard to tell what's happening in 3D. So here I'm in a perspective view, and when I move it within my view, you'll see it's moving in both the front and the top in kind of a weird way that you don't necessarily expect. It's moving in, I move it in a straight line here, and it moves in weird diagonal lines in those other views. In Blender, if you press the F12 button, it renders the scene. And it's kind of random, I think, which viewport the rendered image shows up in. You can press Escape to go back. So again, if I press F12, by rendering the scene, it means it produces an image of what this looks like with all the lighting and everything, sort of a more professional quality image that you can save and upload and things like that. On the right hand side, again, this little icon that looks like a cube tells you things like your object's rotation, location. You can edit these. So if I want to put it back at 0, 0, 0, I can simply edit the coordinates. This icon here is your material. The color of an object that's made out of plastic is usually its diffuse material. So if you click on diffuse, I can pick a different color for this cube. As I change the colors, I see the cube color change. And if I hit F12 again, when I render, it'll render the cube in a different color. I hit Escape, and I'm back here. I can change the lighting by right-clicking on the light and moving the light around to achieve the effect of having the cube lit from a different direction. Now the light's probably behind the camera. Remember, this is the camera. So now that the since the light's down low, the top of the cube is dark. So manipulating these objects by clicking the arrows works, but often you want to use the keyboard. So in order to use the keyboard to begin moving the object, I hit the G key. And once I press the G key, I just tap it, the object will continue to move until I hit Enter, Control and Z to undo it, and I'll try it again if I hit the G key. So I can hit Enter to apply it, or I can also right click to undo it, and left click to accept it. So if you're uncertain about that, try them and then hit Control Z to undo things. In addition to being able to move objects, I can also rotate objects. If I hit the R key, I can rotate the object around. It kind of attempts to imagine that there's an imaginary cord that goes from the center of the object to wherever my mouse is. And as I move my mouse, it attempts to rotate the object the same way that that little line is rotated. That can be quite difficult to do in a 3D view like this. In a 2D view, like the front perspective, it makes good sense. You can rotate nicely around the y-axis here. A better way to rotate is to pick an axis to rotate around. So if I want to spin this around this blue z-axis, I can hit R, and then before I move my mouse, I hit Z. So this is a constrained rotation. It'll only rotate around the z-axis. I'm going to right-click to reject that. Another thing that you can do is you can hit S to scale, which brings it up or down. Sometimes I want to scale it only in one direction, so I only want to scale it up in the z-axis. So I just press the S and the Z key one after the other. So first S, I tap it, and then I tap the Z key, and then I move the mouse. And when I'm happy with that, I can left click, or I can hit Enter. I can hit Control Z to undo something that was a mistake. You're going to make a lot of mistakes in Blender. It's good to be able to undo them. So sometimes I want to do something by a specific amount. Like I might want to move the object to the right exactly 4 squares. To do that, I'm going to press the G key for grab, which means I'm going to start moving it. I'm going to press the X key to say I want to move it in the X, and I'm going to type the number 4 to say I want to move 4 squares. So GX4, and then to accept that, I hit Enter. I'm going to hit Control Z again, and I'm going to show you real quickly, without even touching the mouse, I can move this cube 4 units in the X direction by pressing G, X, 4, Enter. I just moved it 4 units in the Y direction by pressing G, Y, 4, Enter. This also works for rotation. I can rotate around the Z axis by 45 degrees. So I typed G, Y, G, Z, 45. I didn't do it around the Y axis. I'm not going to accept that. I'll show you again. I press the G key, and pay attention to what happens on the screen. At the bottom it's telling me dx, dy, and dz. And if I press Y, so I press GY, and at the bottom it's telling me the delta, but it's saying along the global Y. Right? And if I were to say 3, it says move 3 along the global Y down at the bottom. So it's kind of telling you what's going on. I'm going to right click to reject that. I'm going to rotate around the y-axis by 45 degrees. I just did R, Y, 45, and I'll hit Enter to accept it. Using the middle mouse button, I can orbit around, and I now see my cube there. Looking at where my camera is, if I were to render the scene, I probably won't see much of the cube. So how can we fix this? We can right-click to select the camera, and we can rotate it, trying to get it to point at the cube. If it looks like it's pointed at the cube in all views, it probably is, and I can hit F12. I hit escape to cancel that. So if you left click anywhere on the scene, it'll place a 3D cursor. So looking down from the top, I might say I want to insert an object at this location, and from the front I might say I want it to be slightly above the cube. So this is where it comes in handy to have a 3D cursor. And now remember, for each panel there is options across the bottom. If I press Shift and the middle button, I can scroll these options. So Shift and the middle mouse button to scroll the options. That also works here. Shift and middle mouse button scrolls you around. Right. Then I can add a mesh. For the most part, we're going to be using meshes, and I could add a sphere. So now I have an object with a sphere, or a scene with a sphere as well as a cube. If I render it from the camera's viewpoint, I see that sphere. It's receiving a shadow from the cube. Let's move the light up a little bit and render this again. So there's the sphere in the bottom left and the cube in the right. One thing you might want to do is you can actually choose your viewpoint to be your camera. That way, if I right-click the objects and move them around, I can see where they're going to fall in the scene before I render it. So this can be useful for placing objects. So this covers a lot of Blender. Again, if I right-click on an object, I can select it. I can come over here and choose the material for this new object. I might have to scroll up. So this is worth mentioning. This icosphere has no material. I click on plus to give it a new material, and then I can give that new material a color. I'll go through that whole process again. I'll pick a viewpoint. I'll try to position the 3D cursor where I want a new object to be. So I'm going to put it right in between, let me do it in the camera, right in between the sphere and the cube. And it looks like it's probably at a reasonable height and depth as well. I'll put it a little bit closer to the camera. Sometimes you need to go back and forth a few times like that. So it's a little bit closer to the camera and it's right in between there. I'm going to hit, in any one of these viewports, it doesn't matter, add, mesh, and I'm going to add a torus is a donut shape. So I'm going to add a torus. It's really big here if I look at the camera, so I'm going to hit the S key and scale it down a little bit. And I'd like to be looking at it a little bit more straight on. So I'm going to hit the R key, and I don't like that rotation. I'm going to rotate it around until it points at the camera. Let me point out really quickly, if you hit the R key and then you hit the R key again, it sometimes is easier to rotate the object because it moves like a trackball. So I press the R key twice, and I'm going to position that torus so it points somewhat straight at the camera. Right? Now if I hit F12, I have my scene with a torus, a icosphere, and a cube. And I can take the torus, and I click on the materials icon here on the right. It has no material. I hit the new button and it gets a material, and I can pick a color for the torus. So I want a green torus. Notice that you can see each facet of these objects. If I want an object to appear smooth, I'm going to click on it and I'm going to press the T button, T to get these tools over here on the left, and under shading, so your user interface should look something like this. You should be able to find shading, and you hit smooth. If you hit flat, then it has a bunch of flat faces. If you hit smooth, then it appears smooth. I might want to do that for the torus as well. I'm going to right click to select it and then hit smooth. And then if I render it with F12, now those objects appear to be smooth. Of course, the sphere looks smooth inside of it, but the outsides still look faceted. If you want that to look smoother, that'll be a topic for another day. So hopefully you know now enough to work with Blender a little bit. If I right click and hit join area, if I right click in between these two and hit join area, I can replace one of these with the other. I'm going to take the bottom, I'm going to hit join area, and I'm going to merge it up to the top so I've only got one view. So this is sort of your introduction to Blender and the user interface. This should be enough for you guys to produce an interesting picture. Alright, after I have rendered an image pressing F12 and I'm in the render screen, I can save the image by clicking down at the bottom of that window. Under image, I can hit save as image or save a copy. And I can simply give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call it, I'm going to put it in my desktop, and I'm going to call it untitled.png. I'm going to go ahead and leave that, and you know what, I'll put my name on here. I'll call it Femiani.png, and I will hit save as image. And that creates an image on my desktop. So I have an image here on my desktop, which is a PNG image. If I double click on that, it'll open it up in my image editor. And I can upload that to the class website, for instance, as an example of a scene that I've created. So at this point in time, you guys have the ability to render an image, insert objects, and move them around. My challenge to you is to create whatever interesting scene you want by moving objects around. Bear in mind that Blender has a number of operations that I did not describe. You will very likely accidentally do the wrong thing. So remember Control-Z to undo when something goes wrong and to save your work periodically. Thank you very much.